Yes, my name is Ruth Llewellyn, and I was the director of Tri-County Employee Assistance Program, but we merged with another. So now we are called Life Services EAP, and I am an account manager for them. And so with all of this, this year, we always use Macedonia kind of like our beginning mark for changing up the drug and alcohol training programs for the drug-free workplace. So I thought, instead of going through all of the things that we've done in the past, which has been repetitive for the last few years, we've gone highlighting some different points for the training. And so to begin with, we're going to spend some time looking at some of the benefits with the new merger, because I feel like it benefits a lot. In the past, maybe that the EAP only benefited individuals that actually came for counseling, but now with this new company, it really does provide benefits to everyone, even if you don't engage in counseling services. And so, like I said, the new name is Life Services EAP, and I don't know if Annette's put up the posters and stuff, but now you would call the 1-800 number instead of our 762 number. And even if you call the old number, we still are answering that and still help direct individuals to calling this other number. So obviously this is a call center that will help direct what's most appropriate for whatever your concerns are. It is 24 hours, so there's individuals that are there in cases of crisis. If you're struggling in the middle of the night, you feel like you need to talk with someone, they have the ability to forward that and manage that for you. As a supervisor, you can also refer and call that same number 24/7. One of the nice things with the merger is that previously, for Macedonia, you only had the ability to come to our Akron office or the Solon location, but now this is a national EAP, so there are providers all over the state of Ohio as well as nationally, so you're not limited in just having to be seen at the Akron location or the Solon location. I will tell you though that when you call, once you identify yourself as an employee of the city of Macedonia, they have like their own triage. They'll encourage or try and schedule you initially with Akron, then they might try and schedule you with Fairlawn, but you can tell them that if you prefer that you want a location closer to your home, you can request that as well. For all that don't engage in counseling services, it also comes with an enhanced website. And so I brought papers here because to utilize the website, you have a user ID, which is Macedonia, all in lower caps, and then the password is employee. And so this will allow you access to their savings page that offers different discounts and coupons and stuff for restaurants and theaters. It allows you access to different webinars on wellness topics. The 1-800 number also that's different. As we've always offered legal and financial counseling, you actually would have to come into the office for financial counseling and have an appointment with our financial counselor. Now with this new number, they will actually set you up with a financial counselor on the phone. So you're not limited to having to schedule an appointment and come in person. And what we found truly in the history of our EAP, while we offer financial counseling and individuals schedule appointments to meet with him, over 90% of them no-show or last-minute cancel their appointments. So whether or not there's some defensiveness or denial or minimization, maybe in the immediacy of a crisis, they call, make the appointment to talk to someone about their finances, but inevitably individuals don't actually show for their appointments. So hopefully this will afford people maybe some anonymity or maybe some increased confidentiality in utilizing this. And the same way with the legal services, you'll get to talk to an expert that's not necessarily local that will help you with whatever your legal questions are or concerns. and then if it's warranted and you need additional help, they will help then direct you to providers in the area. So remember, with the EAP benefit, you, your spouse, and any dependents you have up to age 26 are each entitled to 6 free visits per contract year with the EAP. One of the nice things, again, with the merger is they actually do is 6 free visits per concern, identifying concern. So it isn't really limited to just 6 in a year. It could be multiple depending on what your presenting issue is. And so one of the things why workers' comp gives employers discounts for having an EAP is because it's recognized that substance abuse and addiction go hand in hand with personal problems. And that the hope is that by having these trainings and having an EAP and the visibility of it would make individuals choose to initiate counseling for themselves before it becomes a problem. And that sometimes possibly dealing with personal problems early on prevents then that progression into substance abuse and addiction. The one thing I always say, though, when we do these trainings and even in utilizing the EAP is that it's really meant to help individuals that have substance use or abuse issues. When it comes to addiction, what happens with addiction? What prevents individuals with addiction from actually voluntarily coming to the EAP?
Stigma.
Stigma, that's a good one. Is that in general or just for individuals with substance abuse? I mean, sometimes people, right, there's sometimes some stigma just attached to, even today, no matter how progressive we are, we still have, there's some stigma attached to mental health issues and individuals seeking out counseling for themselves, even though we try to educate on that and wonderful TV shows, a lot of the newest sick dramas that are out addresses, right, mental health issues. What's the one that's just starting about the guy that commits suicide and how his friends recover from it? Yeah. And so, really though, one of the things that stops individuals that are addicted to substances is denial, right? That they don't always recognize that they would need this help or benefit from this help. But hopefully in talking about this more, people around an individual that's struggling can take some different steps or actions in helping them get the help they need. So we're going to look over quickly some of the objectives of this, what the impact of substance abuse is in the workplace. Again, spending more time just looking at abuse and addiction, what the signs and symptoms are, the impact of it on family and coworkers, then how better to utilize the EAP for assistance. And then I thought that it's valuable to talk more about what confidentiality is, because that oftentimes is a big concern for individuals as far as who's going to know. And I did spend time when I spoke with the supervisors and talking about their role also in maintaining or preserving a person's confidentiality. We're going to just keep going on. So when we look at, I've been doing this for 30 years. So I actually became a therapist and started this before drug-free workplace even became an issue within an employment setting. So when companies started rolling that out, there was a lot of anger and pushback from companies as well as employees that they felt like it was a violation of their rights in having that. So it's interesting now to have been part of it all these years and to see how it has progressed and just considered normal or well received most of the time in employment settings. But one of the things it's meant to accomplish, of course, is that it sends out a clear message that alcohol and drugs are prohibited in the workplace. And part of that is, for those of you that have listened to my presentations over the years, you realize that some individuals unwittingly or unknowingly are coming into the workplace impaired and not realizing that. And so part of the trainings is meant to reach out to those individuals as well and helping you make good decisions for yourself about how you use or when you use. So a good example would be, what, was it last Thursday night when the Browns won? You know, and you wonder how many, that was a Thursday night, late night, how many individuals, right, went into work the next morning impaired, or how many of them possibly was smart and chose to call off.
How many have supervisor training for drug-free workplace Friday morning?
Just saying.
Same.
The other thing that it hopes to accomplish is that to encourage employees to voluntarily seek out help. And so, like I was just saying a moment ago, the hope is for individuals that find themselves maybe struggling and that concerns with maybe that they find themselves at times abusing substances, maybe not necessarily experiencing addiction, but recognizing that they have those struggles with it and that they would voluntarily seek help for that. For when we look at then a drug-free workplace program, it's very comprehensive in that it has all of these components. And so, I don't know, Annette and I had talked about making sure that all of you reviewed again your own workplace policy on what your drug-free workplace looks like. Though I think the morning class said that had not happened yet, but wanting to make sure that you have re-familiarized yourself with that and know what your employer is expecting with that. With that, as was pointed out, the supervisors have their own hour of training in helping them look at and be able to recognize problematic behavior in the workplace and how to make appropriate referrals to the EAP based on what they're observing. Another piece of that then is what you're experiencing now, which is this employee education, which is teaching you how to, what the signs and symptoms are, the progression, the difference between abuse and addiction, and then how to better utilize your EAP benefit. Having an employee assistance program also gives employers a different level of discount with their workers' compensation claims. So each of these different things, components, provide a different tier of benefits to the employer under workers' compensation and getting a discount in their premiums. And then finally, the level of drug testing that an employer utilizes. So some companies, we know, only do pre-employment testing. Some do pre-employment and post-accident. Some do those and include random testing. And then the fourth component would be reasonable suspicion testing. So my understanding is that the City of Macedonia employs that you are subject to all four types of testing, right? Correct. And so that would mean that post-accident would mean after an accident regardless. Well, again, I guess I'm not familiar with your policy, but typically we would look at anyone that would be involved in the accident. They would all be tested for that instead of trying to identify who caused the accident. Because sometimes it could be the impaired person that caused it and injured others as well. So the thought has switched to testing everyone that was involved. So the reason we have these policies, though, is to protect the health and safety of all employees, customers, and the public. And so again, when they first started coming out, people thought it was a violation of their rights when companies first started enacting a drug-free workplace. But ironically, it is meant to actually provide safety and protect your rights to having and being able to come to work in a safe environment. It's also meant to safeguard, though, the employer as well from theft and destruction, because we do know that individuals that are at least struggling with addiction, oftentimes theft goes hand in hand with that addiction. To maintain the company's integrity and reputation out in the community, and then to also comply with the Drug-Free Workplace Act of 1988. So there's lots of functions that the policy provides or serves for an employer. So I'm going to just keep going through some of these. When we look at the impact of substance abuse in the workplace, we recognize that, and as you've listened to me over the years talk about it, there's a significant ripple effect that comes from it. But here's a new statistic I brought in this year. When 60% of the world's illegal drugs are consumed by American drug users. Now remember, we just say drug users. We're not saying addicts. We're not even saying drug abusers. So if you remember from past trainings, I said that in the evolution of substance use, we recognize and have come to accept recreational use, right, as more normal. We don't necessarily even think of it as problematic until it of itself starts to create problems for an individual. So 2 million Americans use heroin, 6 million use cocaine, 18 million have an alcohol abuse problem, and an estimated 23 million people use marijuana at least 4 times in a week. And so all these statistics now come to you from the American Council for Drug Education. And so, again, those alcohol abuse users or individuals that abuse alcohol and those individuals that use marijuana, the hope is that maybe these classes would help create some insight or shift for individuals, possibly having you take a look at your own use again and maybe considering wanting to utilize the EAP to maybe shift some of your use. When we look at the impact, so substance use impacts an employee's health. So people who use alcohol or drugs neglect their nutrition. It impacts their sleep. Oftentimes we find them not even meeting some of their basic health needs. So with this also, it depresses the person's immune system and leaves them susceptible and open to illness and disease. So that impacts an employer's health benefits because we see higher utilization of those benefits, increased use of sick time, and higher absenteeism and tardiness from that. It also affects productivity. So employees who are substance abusers can be or oftentimes can experience physical and mental impairment while on the job. Substance abuse interferes with job satisfaction and the motivation to do a good job. It impacts workplace output. We often see increased errors with that, lower quality of work, and then reduced customer satisfaction. With decision making, we know that it also impedes or impairs their ability to make good decisions, and part of that comes from having a distorted perception of their own abilities. Here, the substance abuse impacts on the workplace includes reduced innovation, reduced creativity, less competitiveness, poor decisions, and this can be a daily thing, it could be a random thing, but even it takes one day for that to create an unsafe work environment for all around that person. And that leads to abuse include impaired vision, hearing and muscle coordination, low levels of attention, alertness, mental acuity. Again, I apologize. I had interns help create the presentation since it's a new one and there's just a couple typos in it. Its impact on the workplace includes increased accidents and more workers' comp claims. So again, hence why workers' comp pushes for this, because to see this as a cost-saving measure. Why do you think substance abuse impacts employee morale? Why would that be an issue or a case in this?
Picking up their slack.
Picking up their slack. So yeah, sometimes the individual will overcompensate or have to pick up their slack if they're calling off all the time. Anything else? It's interesting because whether it's from these trainings or education elsewhere, you know, I always like to share with you guys my latest antidotes in the past year. I had one company, so if you think backwards, like we teach supervisors to look at poor performance or a shift in performance for an individual, that they're not as productive or doing as well. We had an individual in a company where 6 different employees had, over a period of time, kept going to HR telling them they smelled alcohol on their coworkers' breath. And the supervisor would go back through his notes and observe that they were not seeing attendance issues, we're not seeing low productivity, the person was doing a good job at work, but after the 6th person had come forward saying something to them, they felt like they had to act, because now, as I tell supervisors, if you have knowledge and you don't act on it, you've now made yourself liable, from like a litigation standpoint if something happens. So once that other individual came forward, and let me just say, this gentleman is a very likable person, so it wasn't like from a personality clash or something. So after the 6th person came forward and complained, they finally went up to him. They could smell it at that point. They did that would be reasonable suspicion testing, and he blew like at a .12 at work. So, that's pretty significant BAC while you're at work, and made the mandatory referral. And when I did the assessment with him, he confided that he would have a beer in the parking lot before he went into work. He would drink on his lunch hour in the bathroom. He would have another beer in the car, or few, before he would actually leave the parking lot to go home, and then continue his use throughout the evening. And so here's an example of what we teach supervisors, of all the things to look for, and this gentleman did not evidence any of those, but the efforts were driven more from co-workers coming in and expressing concern. Obviously, for this gentleman, he had to go into residential treatment because, he evidenced high tolerance, because we weren't seeing poor performance, or actually, you didn't recognize physical impairment from him. But we do know, correct, that he was physically impaired, especially when he evidenced that high of a BAC. So it really does tell you that employees or co-workers feel, recognize that, feel a discomfort when they're aware that another person has some level of impairment, even if they can't necessarily recognize it. So it does impact morale, and that it creates, oftentimes a strain on the relationships between coworkers. Organizations that appear to condone substance abuse then also create the impression that they don't care. And so that's why we do part of the supervisory training, is to teach supervisors that this is not a punitive effort, because sometimes it might feel like that, but it's an effort to help give this person an opportunity to get help that they most likely would not have sought out on their own. And in talking with this gentleman, lots of problems in his family life, somewhat isolated within his own family because of his substance, his wife. By the time he would get home from work, he had a lot to drink, and she was just really fed up with some of that behavior that was going on. So also the impact then on the workplace would include higher turnover, lower quality, and reduced team effort. The other example I use with individuals though too is that, that calling off, having somebody call off all the time because of that abuse. Also creates that strain, because as you said, having to pick up the slack for that individual or that coworker. We also know that substance abuse affects agencies' image and their community relationships. So in efforts at preserving the integrity of your workplace, you benefit from these trainings, and also from choosing to act on information when you recognize that someone has a substance abuse problem. Accidents, lawsuits, and other incidents stemming from that really can get lots of media attention and can hurt an organization's reputation in the community. So, why do individuals use? Well, we recognize from some of the other trainings that I've done for you, typically, the majority of people first begin any of their substance use in a social setting where it is acceptable. Oftentimes when, with some of the problems that we're seeing now with painkillers and that, we do recognize that for those individuals, the path started differently, right? And you oftentimes began first with a medication prescribed by their doctor. But after the initial use or exposure, we see then a different relationship develop for individuals with those substances. Again, depending on how stressful a nature of the work that you do, a lot of individuals will use substances as a way to relieve stress. And not that that's not common or even a problem. The problem comes into play when that becomes a repeated pattern of way of managing your stressors. Because that then can lead a person into developing a problem when that's the only way they know how to manage those feelings inside, by turning to a drug or looking forward to that drink when they get home from work. And so that ongoing relationship sets a person up to be vulnerable in their substance use. Other reasons too, though, is that we do recognize or see that comorbidity of individuals that abuse substances because of depression issues or anxiety issues. And so part of that, looking at that, let me just flip backwards, again, is why there's the benefit or value of having an employee assistance program and making sure that that kind of help is available in a confidential way to individuals. We've seen lots of media attention, right, in looking at least within the last 6 months, 2 famous individuals that committed suicide that both had addiction issues. Do you guys remember who the 2 are?
Robin Williams.
That was so I will come back into that. That was I think he's been gone a long time.
Really? Sorry.
Not very long. But I do stress the relevance of him to the other 2 that
Chris
were more.
Cornell?
Huh?
Chris Cornell?
I got it about 2 years ago.
Really? Is he dead?
Jimi Hendrix.
Okay, fashion designer. That would be one clue.
Spade.
Kate Spade. So Kate Spade, right? She committed suicide and had addiction issues. And then Anthony Bourdain. Is it Anthony Bourdain?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. The 2 of them both, right, within
Yeah.
few weeks of each other, and both committed suicide the same way that Robin Williams. They both hung themselves. So yes, I do say that they all 3 had addiction issues or abuse issues, and struggled with depression as well. So we realize that there is that emotional component to substance abuse and addiction. Common drugs of abuse. So as I've gone through in past years, I've gone into depth with you about alcohol, marijuana, inhalants, stimulants, depressants, narcotics, hallucinogens, and designer drugs. And so we know that individuals can abuse a substance to modify or control their mood or state of mind in a manner that is illegal and harmful to oneself or others. So when you think about how pure that statement is, when we think about social use, we're talking about 1 or 2 drinks, right, of alcohol. Again, such a gray area when we talk about what using drugs looks like in a legal manner, so that's why I'm just sticking with alcohol. Anything then that would put you in the illegal range of a DUI is what we would apply here, which could be 4 or more drinks that we would look at for an individual choosing to try and modify their mood or behavior, becomes then an area of what we would look at as abuse. So we know that potential consequences then when a person drinks too much or engages in using illegal substances is that we have accidents, blackouts, legal problems, poor job performance, so there's that one piece, family problems, sexual behavior that increases, that puts them at risk for a variety of offenses or disease. Oftentimes you see their problems occurring more at home before it becomes evident in the workplace. So you might be privileged to knowing that an individual is having some of those problems within their own family. The difference then between addiction and abuse is that with addiction, we see that there is this compulsion. And so remember, it's not necessarily how much a person is consuming or using, it's more about those efforts that try and quit. That the person that is experiencing addiction is compelled to use and often makes repeated efforts to try and control their use or decrease the amount or the frequency of it, and they fail. And that often comes from that they have an increased tolerance for it. So when we look at it and trying to understand addiction more, for every 1 in 10 people, those are the individuals we would see that addiction can occur. So abuse can lead to addiction. Some of the symptoms or characteristics of addiction is that it parallels the disease model, meaning that it's chronic. It goes through stages, so it is progressive. It's primary, meaning it's the primary piece that they're dealing with, though, as I was saying earlier, we do assign what we call comorbid diseases or issues that they're struggling with, such as depression or anxiety. And it's terminal, meaning that for many, it can result in death for that person. Because of addiction being recognized as a disease and going through these characteristics, it is covered under medical insurance. And so for like that gentleman that I was talking about, unfortunately, for individuals that are professionals, the treatment facilities that an individual might choose comes at a much more expensive rate. So for him, it costs $18,000, he shared with me, to go through residential treatment. What's the number one thing, though, that we would say is characterized by addiction that keeps a person stuck in addiction? I said it earlier. Oh my gosh, years of training, right? Denial. That they deny or minimize that there's a problem or have a million excuses or are able to rationalize some of the aftermath of their use, some of the negative consequences of that. If you guys remember, 28 years ago, I used to do the DUI programs down in Wayne and Maslin County, and that was my so obviously it was starting out new. One of my very first gentlemen, he was in his 50s and lost his job. It was his 3rd or 4th DUI, divorce, his kids don't talk to him, and it was, it's the no good system, it's the corrupt police, it's his SOB, employer, it's his no good children. And so, again, he was evidencing denial and blaming everything else in his life for what was happening instead of being able to recognize that it was his own substance abuse that was causing those problems for him. We do recognize that addiction is a family disease, meaning that there is a hereditary component to it, so that when we assess individuals, that's one of the first things we look for, and not just necessarily within your nuclear family, but within your extended family. We look at if there are other family members that have addiction issues. We do recognize those that for some individuals it can just be a pattern of behavior over time. Like I said, when you start to create a dependency, when you use substances to replace other coping behaviors for yourself, you create or learn a new type of dependency. When I first became a counselor, we used to say, that marijuana was not addicting. And part of that was because individuals that use marijuana, we thought that addiction, to be addicted to something meant that you would go through withdrawal symptoms. And so physical withdrawal symptoms. And so that was why it was always said that marijuana was not an addictive substance, because a person does not go through physical withdrawals when they quit using, like an individual could with alcohol. But we recognize now the addictive nature of marijuana, that it is mentally addicting and emotionally addicting for individuals. I have clients that, have the same mindset That's all they can think about, when they can use again, where they're gonna get it, how it's going to feel, who they're gonna smoke with or get high with. And so we recognize that as a science, over the years, we continue to increase our knowledge in trying to understand all of the different components that play into addiction. And for some individuals, for some, we see a slow decline into addiction, and then others, you could see that rapid. Again, it just depends on the substance that they're using and the family history behind that. Other factors, some individuals, their addiction is part of a self-destructive lifestyle, poor life choices. Some individuals have an attitude of not caring or have a high risk-taking mindset. Again, like I was saying earlier, it could be relief from depression or crisis in their lives. Some develop a serious problem then before they even realize it. In one of my companies, when you were saying about the productivity piece, we had a company where the individual was calling off repeatedly for depression, and the co-workers were resentful that it started to become a joke that that this individual had called off again and again. What else is new? It used to become like a little private joke amongst all of them. And as that progressed for this person, so did the substance abuse. But the employer had a difficult time recognizing what was the depression and the substance abuse. And then this person finally committed suicide. And so the ripple effect in the workplace, because of the increased how it had put previously, the anger they felt from all the having to overcompensate for the absences, then of course led to significant feelings of guilt in that. So even though we do all of the trainings and try and help, it's still an imperfect science, and because as individuals we struggle with acting on these insights as well, or we struggle with acting when we see some of the signs and symptoms of a person that has addiction issues or abuse issues. So one of the biggest things though, and this is what we encourage supervisors to recognize, is that changes in attendance or quality of work and productivity is oftentimes one of the key symptoms that maybe abuse could be going on. But likewise, it could be a mental or emotional issue as well. Unusual outbreaks of temper, changes in their mood, acting paranoid or confused, defensiveness or not taking responsibility for their actions, withdrawing from family and friends. And so oftentimes you might be privileged to hearing that or hearing things that they're sharing with. Addiction or abuses substances, it affects not just themselves but everyone around them, and it impacts them emotionally, behaviorally, physically. From an emotional standpoint, the impact we can see aggression or burnout, again, anxiety, depression, paranoia, denial. Behaviorally, we can see impaired coordination, slowed reaction time, slurred speech, and irritability. What do you think, as a supervisor, that they would act on the most in recognizing a problem? For like reasonable suspicion.
Slurred speech.
Correct. Excessive talking, inability to sit still, limited attention span, poor motivation or lack of energy. This morning's group, they were teasing that all of those things apply to somebody. So we do realize, right, that some of that could be symptoms of an attention deficit disorder as well. So what we're talking about is when we see a departure from normal for someone. Some of the physical effects: weight loss, sweating, chills, smell of alcohol. A company went and had a female that had back surgery. So she had a slip and fall, had back surgery. They know she was on painkillers. She lost 80 pounds rapidly within 6 months. They were convinced that she was abusing them. possibly, but they did not document the things we teach supervisors of the other signs and symptoms of impairment. And so it opened up the employer to a huge lawsuit because they sent her through all the testing, which was considered a violation of her rights based just on weight loss. And so part of the supervisory training is helping them look at a greater picture and what does all of the things present. Smell of alcohol, though, is the #1 reason why an employer would do reasonable suspicion testing, because they often feel the most comfortable with that. So a person's abuse of alcohol or other drugs affects everyone around him or her. Often those affected by someone who has a drug or alcohol problem actually will change their behavior to adapt to that person's use. Whether they adapt to it, they ignore it, or they struggle to cope with it in another way. We call that enabling behavior, right? Because those efforts of changing or adapting or overcompensating for them kind of enables them to continue to do the problematic behavior. So ironically, the best thing to do is to not deal with their problem, meaning that you would talk to a supervisor or you would share with HR possibly what your concerns are, what you're seeing in the workplace. So again, back to that gentleman that they could smell the alcohol on his breath. They were choosing not to deal with it by just going directly to HR and reporting it. So when we think of enabling, it would be rationalizing it or protecting that person by covering it up or just avoiding it, because a lot of times people will say, it's not my problem, I'm not going to deal with it. From an assistant standpoint then, lots of times, it's important in recognizing that there is help available, and that help is through your employer here, whether it be that you go through your supervisor, whether or not it's that you on your own voluntarily initiate contact with the employee assistance program. Oftentimes the supervisor might just be limited to making a referral to you based on personal problems, and it becomes up to the employee to decide whether or not they actually are going to want to benefit from coming or from the help available to them. So again, we often distinguish, and I probably should have said this in the supervisory training, it's interesting how many individuals, when they come to see me, will say that their supervisor encouraged them to come, and how that made them feel validated or supported or recognized that someone cared. It's an unfortunate thing, I think, in today's world, that people feel so stressed and inundated with things that oftentimes they don't perceive that others care about them or are willing to take that time or effort to support them. One of the biggest things, though, is the issue of confidentiality. So remembering that it is an employee's responsibility to decide whether or not to seek help. We do know addiction is treatable and reversible, meaning, that's a bad word, is treatable and can halt the progression. I don't necessarily think that it's reversible. Some of the impacts, the physical impacts of it can be reversed, meaning the impact that it has on your overall health. But we do know that a person, when they quit using, if they start or relapse again, they start from that very point. They don't start from the beginning. They don't lose their tolerance or anything. The confidentiality piece I was sharing with, I think with the supervisors as well, is going to take on a new level of meaning, because I don't know if any of you saw the Beacon Journal, the woman that was suing, that was being drug tested as part of her pre-employment? I don't know if it was part of pre-employment or random, and you know how you have somebody present observing you when you take your urine tests. She felt that it was an invasion of her privacy having someone there, and she was suing for that. So we'll see what the impact that lawsuit has on future drug testing, if they will still have people observed when they're, quote, taking their test, their drug test. So in conclusion, there is help available to you. Your supervisor, going to a supervisor and sharing with them what you're struggling with affords you the opportunity to get support that way, an opportunity to come and utilize the EAP. There are self-support, groups out there such as AA, Al-Anon, Alateen. There's community hotlines available. Our 1-800 number provides that same kind of resource available to you and can connect you with that. And confidentiality is governed by law, meaning that it's illegal for us to ever disclose to your employer or to anyone that you're utilizing our services. Likewise, if you have a dependent, that's 18 or older that comes and chooses to utilize the EAP, you are not privileged as the parent to know if they're coming or to know details of that unless your child signs a release. Because that is one of the things we've seen with the rise in different varying degrees of substance abuse in the community. And we are seeing a lot more dependents in that 18 to 26 range coming in under their parents' benefit and wanting services. But the parent is making that mandatory upon that child being able to stay in the home longer. But we cannot let you know as a parent that your dependent's coming unless they sign a release giving us permission to do that. Again, because of the legal nature of confidentiality. Again, recognize the impact of substance abuse in the workplace. Make sure that when Annette passes out your own specific drug-free workplace policy for the city of Macedonia, that you read and understand it to prevent any kind of complications for yourself down the road. And remember that there's lots of different assistance and help available to you. Any questions, comments? All right. Thank you.